Bonjour, tout le monde. I'm your host, Linus Kaiser, and today we will be talking about the Second Great War, World War II. Now you might be asking me, Linus Kaiser, how do we start such a large topic? Well, I'll tell you. Japan.
During the 1920s, Japan became increasingly more democratic. In 1922, Japan signed a treaty respecting China's borders, and in 1928, Japan signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, renouncing war. This did not last long, however. In the 1930s, when the Great Depression hit Japan, the democratic government was blamed for it. Military leaders soon won popular vote. They wanted to keep national Japanese tradition in power and decided to keep Emperor Hirohito as head of state. Now Japan planned on creating a Pacific empire which included the conquering of China. Japan had heavy investments in the iron and coal-rich province of Manchuria. In 1931, Japan seized the area and set up a puppet government. This invasion was a challenge to the League of Nations. The League protested, but Japan ignored and withdrew from the League in 1933. Then, on July 7, 1937, shots were fired near a railroad bridge in Beijing. Soon, Japanese forces swept through northern China. Beijing and Nanking fell. Japanese troops killed tens of thousands in what became known as the Rape of Nanking. Seeing the League of Nations' lack of aggression, Mussolini sought to build his own African empire. In October 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie urged for help from the League of Nations. The League did nothing, however. Hitler had always opposed the Treaty of Versailles.
Ich hasse es. Geh raus, ich hasse es.
The treaty limited Germany's size, and Germany was ordered to obey these restrictions. Hitler was all like,
Nein!
And in March 1935, Hitler announced he would not obey these restrictions. Germany began building its armed forces. The League of Nations' failure to act gave Hitler confidence. And on March 7, 1936, troops moved on the Rhineland. Like a rhinestone cowboy. Hitler's strength convinced Mussolini that they should seek an alliance, and they came to create the Rome-Berlin Axis. And in November 1936, Japan joined and became the Axis powers. In July 1936, Spanish fascists favoring Francisco Franco started the Spanish Civil War. Hitler and Mussolini sent troops and airplanes to help Francisco's nationalists. In 1939, Franco became the fascist dictator of Spain. Many Americans resisted her role as a world leader and began to practice isolationism, the belief that political ties should be avoided. Beginning in 1935, Congress passed 3 neutrality acts. On November 5, 1937, Hitler announced he wanted to absorb Austria and Czechoslovakia into the Third Reich. On March 1938, Hitler annexed Austria.
Österreich ist meines Land.
In September 1938, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland. The Czechs refused and asked for France's help.
Yo, France, it's Czechoslovakia. Can you help a brother out? No?
With France and Britain ready for war, Mussolini called for the Munich Conference. Held place on September 29, 1938, the Czechs were not invited. In turn for peace, Hitler was given the Sudetenland. Appeasement. Britain and France urged the Soviet Union to hold peace with Germany. And on August 23, 1939, a non-aggression pact was signed between the two. In the pact, they agreed to split Poland and Stalin could have Finland and other Baltic countries. With no threat from the USSR, Hitler had a blitzkrieg on Poland on September 1st, 1939. France and Britain declared war on Hitler on September 3rd, but Poland fell too soon. On September 17th, Stalin sent his troops to the eastern half of Poland, and by March 1940, he had taken over Finland. For 7 months after Poland fell, there was a cease of fire. Then, on April 9th, 1940, Hitler launched on Denmark and Norway. In 4 hours, Denmark fell, and in 2 months, Norway did as well. In May 1940, Hitler began a dramatic sweep through Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The goal of this was to strike France. By May 26, 1940, Germans had trapped Allied forces in the French town of Lille. In great heroism, Great Britain sent 850 ships across the English Channel to Dunkirk to save Allies in France. After Dunkirk, Mussolini joined war, attacking France from the south. By June 14th, Paris fell to Germany. On June 22, 1940, France surrendered to Hitler. After France's fall, Charles de Gaulle set up a government in exile with the goal to reconquer France. With France gone, Britain stood alone. Prime Minister Winston Churchill said he would not give in. Hitler enacted Operation Sea Lion in the summer of 1940 by bombing Great Britain. The Royal Air Force resisted, however. Known as the Battle of Britain, this lasted until May 10, 1941, when German forces ceased fire. With the discouragement of Britain, Hitler began to focus on the Mediterranean. Hitler's first goal in the Mediterranean was North Africa. In September 1940, Mussolini moved from Libya towards Egypt, hoping to seize the Suez Canal. Then in December, Great Britain fought back. Determined to help his Italian allies, Hitler sent General Rommel to fight back in North Africa. Rommel fought the British at Egina and forced them to retreat at Tobruk. Rommel then pushed the British back and seized Tobruk. This loss hit hard on British morale. While Rommel was fighting in North Africa, Hitler attacked the Balkan countries. The goal of this being to build a base for an attack on the Soviet Union. In early 1941, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary joined the Axis powers. On April 6, 1941, Hitler invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. Both fell within 20 days. With the Balkan countries taken control of, Hitler moved on the Soviet Union, enacting Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Hitler began his blitzkrieg invasion on the Soviet Union. On September 8th, Hitler surrounded Leningrad, hoping to starve the people out. 1 million died, but the city refused to fall. On October 2nd, Hitler moved towards Moscow. However, temperatures dropped, and German soldiers were ill-prepared. Moscow was saved, and 500,000 German soldiers lost their lives. Although the US was neutral, on August 9th, Roosevelt met with Churchill and signed the Atlantic Charter. It upheld free trade and gave the right to the people to choose their own government. On September 4th, a U-boat fired on a US destroyer. The Navy responded, but this did not drag the US into war yet. The US was aware of Japanese advances in Asia and were afraid of attack on US-controlled Philippines and Guam. To combat, US funded Chinese resistance. When Japan took over Indochina, US cut off oil shipments to Japan. In spite of this, Japan continued to conquer Asia. Japan's Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto argued that the US fleet in Hawaii was a dagger pointed at their throat. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. 2,400 Americans were killed and another 1,000 were wounded. The next day, the US declared war on Japan. Japan continued its conquests, marching on Manila, seizing Hong Kong, conquering Dutch East Indies and Burma. In April 1942, the US B-52 bombers bombed major cities in Japan. This attack boosted American morale.
Now you're a man! A man, man, man! Now you're a man! A mounty, mounty, man! A man, man, man! You are now a man! You're a man! Now you're a man!
In May 1942, an American fleet intercepted a Japanese strike force. Without this, the Japanese could have easily invaded Australia. The battle that followed was called the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Allies lost more ships in the battle, but stopped Japanese expansion. Japan's next target was the Midway Island. In June 1942, another Japanese code was broken, and Admiral Nimitz knew 150 ships were heading towards Midway. Japanese outnumbered US 4-1, however the US ambushed them. By June 6, 1942, the battle was over, in what became known as the Battle of Midway. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the Allied forces in Japan. The US had learned the Japanese were building a huge airbase on the island of Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, the US landed on Guadalcanal. After 6 months of fighting, the island was under control, and the Battle of Guadalcanal ended. As a part of the European New Order, Nazis claimed that Aryans were a master race and all others were inferior. After Nazi propaganda supported a very ugly picture of the Jews, anti-Semitism spread through Germany. Nazis blamed the Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I and the economic situation that followed it. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws deprived the Jews of their rights to German citizenship, jobs, and property. On November 9th, Nazi stormtroopers attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues after Jewish youth Greenspan shot a German embassy official in Paris. 100 Jews were killed in the night that soon became known as the Kristallnacht. After the Kristallnacht, many Jews fled for safety in other countries. Hitler favored the emigration solution and forced many to emigrate. However, as many Jews were emigrating, many countries refused entry for them. As Hitler could not move Jews out of the country, he moved them into ghettos in Poland. The plan was to make Jews inside of the ghettos starve or die from disease. The Jews, however, held on, creating organizations and often smuggling food and supplies. As Hitler grew impatient waiting for the Jews to die in the ghettos, Hitler came up with his final solution, an extermination of the Jewish race. After Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, Hitler sent SS troops town to town to hunt Jews. The Jewish communities that were not rounded up by the killing squads were relocated to concentration camps. The final solution reached its final stage in 1942, when extermination camps were equipped with gas chambers for mass murder. The gas chambers could kill as many as 6,000 a day. 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, and less than 4 million survived. With the fall of Tobruk, England sent General Bernard Montgomery to North Africa. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched attack on the Egyptian village of El Alamein. By November 3rd, Rommel's army had been beaten. Rommel retreated, and Operation Torch was ignited by the Allies. On November 8th, under the command of General Eisenhower, the Allies landed in Algeria and Morocco. By May 1943, Rommel's team was smashed. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1942, Hitler moved his forces towards Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad began on August 23, 1942. Hitler bombed the city, but the Russians did not back down. By November, 90% of the city was in ruins. Soon, the Russian winter began to set in, and Germans began to freeze. On February 2, 1943, German troops surrendered to the Soviets. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces captured the island of Sicily. The capture of Sicily removed Mussolini from power and he was arrested. On September 3rd, Italy surrendered. Germany held on to northern Italy, however, and put Mussolini back in power. The Allies entered Rome on June 4, 1944. On April 28, 1945, Germans retreated from Italy. The next day, Mussolini was publicly executed. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt set up a program of internment of Japanese Americans. From 1941 to 1946, some 30,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned. By 1942, the war was turning in the Allies' favor. By 1943, the Allies were planning an attack on Germans across the English Channel. Known as D-Day, the Allies began the invasion on June 6, 1944, on the beaches of Normandy. 3,000 Americans died on D-Day, but the Allies held on the beach. A month later, 1 million more troops landed. On August 25th, Allies marched through France. By September, they liberated France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the Netherlands. Now the Allies set attack on Germany. With Allies moving on the west and the Soviets moving east, Hitler made a decision to attack on the west. On December 16th, in the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies pushed back Hitler and won. In March 1945, Allies rolled across the Rhine River. By April 25th, 1945, Soviets surrounded the capital of Berlin. On April 29th, Hitler married his longtime GF, Eva Braun. 2 days later, Hitler killed himself. On May 7, 1945, Eisenhower accepted surrender from the Third Reich. By fall of 1944, Allies were moving on Japan. On October 23rd, the Japanese lost disastrously in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf in spite of the kamikaze. In March 1945, American Marines took Iwo Jima. On April 1st, US moved on the island of Okinawa. On June 22nd, the battle had ended. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another one was dropped on the town of Nagasaki.
It's a mother, don't you know? If they push that button, your ass got to go. It's a mother.
Japanese surrendered to MacArthur on September 2nd. By the end of World War II, 40 million Europeans had died. Many European cities lay in ruins. Famine and disease spread throughout Europe. In 1946, the first of the Nuremberg trials took place. 22 Nazi leaders were charged. After the war, MacArthur began the demilitarization of Japan, and on May 3, 1947, a new Japanese constitution went into effect.
I am going to read a story for you. Read along as you listen.
The Green Llama Strike.
With the fall of Tobruk, England sent General Bernard Montgomery to North Africa. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched attack on Egyptian. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched attack on the Egyptian village of El Alamein. By November 3rd, Rommel's army had been beaten. Rommel retreated, and Operation Torch was ignited by the Allies. On November 8th, under the command of General Eisenhower, the Allies landed in Algeria and Morocco. By May 1943, Rommel's team was smashed. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1942, Hitler moved his forces towards Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad began on August 23, 1942. Hitler bombed the city, but the Russians did not back down. By November, 90% of the city was in ruins. Soon the Russian winter set in, and the Russian winter began to set in, and Germans began to freeze. On February 2, 1943, German troops surrendered to the Soviets. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces captured the island of Sicily. The capture of Sicily Martinez removed Mussolini and was arrested. The capture of Sicily Martinez removed Mussolini from power and he was arrested. On September 3rd, Italy surrendered. Germany held on to northern Italy, however, and put Mussolini back in power. The Allies entered Rome on June 4th, 1941. On April 28th,